old enough to know how bad life gets.
Obviously, Doctor. You've never been a 13-year-old girl.
You mean an institution? A madhouse? People always call a madhouse someplace, don't they? Put her in someplace.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to sound uncaring.
What do you know about caring? Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears, and the cruel eyes studying you. My mother there. But she's harmless. She's as harmless as one of those stuffed birds.
I am sorry. I only felt... It seems she's hurting you. I meant well.
People always mean well. They cluck their thick tongues and shake their heads and suggest oh so very delicately. Of course, I've suggested it myself. But I hate to even think about it. She needs me. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes.
Get up! No!
Haven't you?
Yes. Sometimes just one time can be enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman.
Norman.
Within global and historical cinema, there is a multitude of films concerning themes around mental health issues. Some of the most mainstream examples include One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Girl Interrupted, Psycho, and Black Swan. After watching these films, I have been drawn to the pattern of extreme differences between the portrayal of male and female mental health issues. I've noticed that portrayals of female mental health issues, in particular depression, but also many other conditions such as borderline personality disorder, OCD, and general anxiety, are more likely to be romanticised and glamorised by female audiences. I'll be exploring these representations, their accuracy, and their impact on the mental health community. With an increasing amount of film and TV with stories centred on mental health struggles, it's also important to acknowledge the accuracy of these portrayals and consider the impact they may have on impressionable audiences, as well as why audiences may be drawn to and so easily influenced by this form of media text. To outline and contextualise my point, I will use a comparison between two films about mental illness. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, directed by Milos Forman, 1975, a film set on an all-male hospital ward, and Girl Interrupted, directed by James Mangold, 1999, set in a female ward. There is a list of similarities between the two films, also outlined in Bodies of Film Press 2013. Both protagonists have an unclear mental state. Both are set in clean and sterile hospitals that include a closed-off nurse's office with a screen to hand out mysterious and mandatory medication. Both hospitals allow minimal privacy for its patients. Both films also have similar plot points, including a character driven to suicide, a short escape to the outside, and a late-night escapade leading to punishment. The list of similarities between the two films is extensive, however they both have such a different atmosphere and message. Both films feel as though they are trying to say something completely different. Jones, 2012, outlines the similarities between McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Lisa in Girl Interrupted, describing both characters as sociopathic, as well as raising that both characters are introduced walking into the hospital from a police car. The protagonists of each film are diagnosed with particularly gendered mental illnesses. Stone, 2014, raises evidence of these gendered mental illnesses in each film, explaining how Susanna in Girl Interrupted is diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which is, quote, 7 times more likely in women than men. And McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, which is, quote, 3 times more likely in men than women. Overall, the diagnosis of each patient alone fits within gendered stereotypes and arguably contributes towards the difference in portrayal and representation. Overall, one of the biggest differences between both films is the gender of the protagonists. The statistics surrounding mental illness and gender are even raised in one scene in Girl Interrupted. When Lisa addresses her sociopathic diagnosis, she says, "We are very rare and we are mostly men." I A criticism of both films is their refusal to confirm the true mental state of both protagonists, which encourages audiences to question their definition of mental illness, but is arguably harmful and dismissive of disorders many people struggle with. As Stone 2014 explains, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, McMurphy attempts to change the hospital and its patients' values by bringing in stereotypically masculine hobbies, such as gambling, fishing and drinking. The film villainises Nurse Ratched, who represents the control and authoritarian nature of the hospital. I believe this overall raises the message to audiences that these characters are not mentally ill but are experiencing a repression of their masculinity. However, it is important to bring back into perspective why these characters are placed in the hospital in the first place. For example, McMurphy has been transferred from imprisonment for statutory rape to the hospital due to antisocial behaviour. The dismissal of the diagnosis of a mental illness is also raised in Girl Interrupted's final sequence, as Susanna raises the question of if she was ever, quote, crazy.
Was I ever crazy? Maybe. Or maybe life is.
Hey.
Stone criticises this by saying, quote, the dismissal of the category of mentally ill may seem politically progressive, but it assimilates and invalidates personal experiences, unquote. Overall, both films dismiss the validity of the protagonist's mental illness while conforming to gendered mental illness stereotypes throughout their narrative. The considerably different representations of mental illness between male and female characters led me to question why the mentally ill female has become so romanticised by audiences and how film has contributed to this. Shasta, 2018, raises how mental illnesses were once shown in mainstream cinema to be, quote, fearful, violent and isolating conditions embodied by serial killers and murderers. Shasta goes on to explain how although this perception is changing with the rise of social media, this has led to the romanticisation of mental illness and the glorification of suicide. Shasta identifies the romanticisation of mental illness as, quote, the depiction of mental illness as more glamorous, attractive or alluring than it truly is. It is important to note that the media has always had an impact on the masses' perception of mental illness. Wall, 2006, states that Americans themselves identify mass media as the source from which they get the most of their knowledge of mental illness, and therefore film plays a large part in educating audiences on mental illness, which is why the romanticisation of mental illness in film is likely to have a direct impact on the inaccurate perception of mental illness in real life. McCloskey, 2020, outlines film representations of mental illness and their contribution to the idolised sad cultures seen on social networking sites such as Tumblr. McCloskey notes that, quote, there are many examples of media, specifically within films, that simply glorify or use mental illness as a scapegoat to excuse violent behaviour by characters, which inaccurately represents real-life people battling these illnesses. McCloskey goes on to explain the personal experience of growing up in Generation Z with little access to information on mental illness and the search to identify oneself and mental illness on streaming services such as Netflix and social networks such as Tumblr, an experience I believe many people can relate to. Overall, McCloskey's research brings attention to the translation of films about mental illness onto social media, creating a culture where such illnesses are romanticised. She addresses that audiences, of course, do engage critically with the media, but there is still clear influence on an individual from the media they choose to engage in. Addressing that there is a clear influence on audiences from the media they choose to engage in is important, but we also must address how and why film is able to influence us so easily. McCloskey explains how films communicate their messages differently with audiences compared to other types of media. She explains that films are, quote, cut, edited, manipulated, organised, etc. in a certain way intentional by the filmmaker. This shaping of text is called media framing. McCloskey references Wedding et al., who describes how films combine our visual sense with auditory stimulation, and how this creates a, quote, trance or dissociative state for audiences comparable to a dream state. The viewer becomes so deeply absorbed by this that they disregard the technical aspects that have gone into creating the film. This can be used to explain why audiences are so impacted by films about mental illness. They may sympathise with or even resonate with characters to a point of romanticisation and disregard that this is a work of fiction. Donaldson, 2005, lists The Three Faces of Eve, 1957, as an example of an older film exploring female mental illness, and explains the changes in society since the late 1950s when the film was released. Donaldson says, quote, Eve White's troublesome behaviour as her alternate Eve Black, dancing with sailors and buying revealing clothing, would probably fail to shock today's viewers. This point led me to question what is used to shock viewers of today. Portrayals of female depression in modern film tend to be a lot more graphic examples, such as Daisy's self-harm and suicide in Girl Interrupted. Combined with the trance or dissociative state created by films as raised by McCloskey, this leads me to the conclusion that audience members accept the behaviours of the protagonist and normalise or even romanticise these self-destructive acts. It is also important to note the actresses portraying these characters. In Girl Interrupted, Angelina Jolie plays Lisa, the destructive sociopath and antagonist of the film. These serious disorders and illnesses being portrayed by Hollywood actresses glamorises the situation of the character for audiences who, when disregarding the technical aspects of the film, may not always separate the actions of the character from the individual portraying them. Overall, the normalisation of mental illness in film impacts audiences who forget to acknowledge the extent to which the film is a work of fiction, especially when these roles are played by stereotypically glamorous and beautiful Hollywood actresses such as Angelina Jolie, Winona Ryder and Jennifer Lawrence. Another issue is the romanticisation of neurodivergence created by the Manic Pixie Dream Girl trope, or MPDG for short. Fike 2022 outlines the coining of the term Manic Pixie Dream Girl by Nathan Rabin in 2007 when writing a retrospective on the film Elizabethtown 2005. Explaining the character played by Kirsten Dunst, he describes how Manic Pixie Dream Girls only exist in the, quote, imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries. Fike explains this character trope, describing the characters as, quote, stunningly attractive, energetic, high on life, full of wacky quirks and idiosyncrasies. Fike explains that although the term was coined in 2005, the character trope has existed in films long before that, listing examples such as Roman Holiday, 1953, Harold and Maude, 1971, and Amelie, 2001. Rabin has expressed regret for coining this term as it leads potentially more complex female characters that are slightly quirky to be given this label. However, it is useful to investigate the impact of this term on the perception of neurodivergent females. Gray Hammond 2020 describes how this trope has been harmful to autistic women. Gray Hammond describes the MPDG as someone who is separated from social conventions, has a whimsical attitude and childlike wonder, and describes how the character is used in films to teach a male protagonist who is jaded and takes life too seriously that there is more to living than his boxed-in world. The MPDG does this by creating adventures and disarming the character. Gray Hammond explains that traits often associated with the MPDG are traits often associated with autism, which overall reduces autistic women to a concept. Overall, these characters are never given the label of autistic, but do fulfill many traits often associated with autism, which therefore leaves audiences with an inaccurate perception of autistic women. Finally, I believe it is important to acknowledge how some films are able to portray aspects of mental illness accurately. Marshall, 2017, outlines in an article for Metro, quote, 13 films that portrayed mental illness in the right way, and gives examples such as Black Swan, 2010, which, quote, powerfully demonstrates the horror of untreated psychosis, and Memento, 2000, which portrays, quote, how often society takes advantage of people with mental illness. Marshall also describes the impact of Girl Interrupted and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, describing how the former explores mental health in adolescence and its effects on not just the sufferer, but the people around them. Marshall goes on to describe the impact of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and how its portrayal of institutionalised cruelty embodied by Nurse Ratched was criticised for potentially putting people off seeking treatment, but also how the film was credited with changing attitudes to psychiatry and encouraging more focus on individual patient needs. In conclusion, I believe that there is sufficient evidence to suggest that societal perceptions of mental illness and neurodivergence have been heavily influenced by film and TV portrayals. Films that date back to the early 1950s have been portraying mental illness in an inaccurate light, and these portrayals have not evolved into accuracy, but instead in an increase in shock factor, portraying graphic scenes of violence, suicide, self-harm and destructive behaviours. It is also important to consider what messages these films send to audiences if their portrayals of mental illness are inaccurate. Are they attempting to glorify mental illness, or is it simply a way of adding depth to character? It is also important to note that these characters are almost always portrayed by well-known white actresses, which I believe leads to further evidence that these films are not representative or inclusive at all. I believe more research into the message each audience member receives from a film depicting mental illness would be an interesting start in understanding what makes these films so popular and often made, as well as research into how individuals suffering with mental illness respond to these films, as it's difficult to name a target audience for these films.